This tutorial assumes you know the basics of Blender. I add a UV sphere with 16 vertices for the base of the pumpkin. I select the top and bottom vertices and use proportional editing to scale the pumpkin along the Z-axis. I select the vertical edge loops and add a single bevel to the edge loops. I then add vertical loop cuts in between these beveled edge loops. I select each of these new edge loops and scale them outward along their normals. I add a subdivision surface modifier. I add vertical loop cuts in the middle of each of the beveled edge loops. I then select each of these new edge loops and scale them inward along their normals. I hide the subdivision surface modifier. I select the top center face, inset it, and delete it. In Edge Select mode, I use Ctrl F to add a grid fill, making sure I have quads for proper geometry. I select the new faces and scale them to 0 along the Z-axis. I repeat these steps for the bottom of the pumpkin. In Object mode, I shade the pumpkin smooth. For the stem, I add a cylinder with 16 vertices. I move and scale it into place on the pumpkin. I select the vertical edge loops and add a single bevel to the edge loops. I then add vertical loop cuts in between these beveled edge loops. I select each of these new edge loops and scale them inward along their normals. Add a subdivision surface modifier. I then add extra horizontal edge loops to sharpen the top and bottom edges. I hide the subdivision surface modifier. I select the top center face and inset it and delete the new faces. In Edge Select mode, I use Ctrl F to add a grid fill, making sure I have quads for proper geometry. I select the entire model and use symmetrize along the Z-axis. I turn the subdivision surface modifier back on and add more horizontal edge loops. I shade smooth. Under the sculpting workspace, I use the grab brush to deform the stem. I'll be using the Node Wrangler add-on. I also make sure I'm in render view and using cycles. Add a Voronoi texture and add a texture coordinate and mapping node using Ctrl T. Change the texture coordinate node to object. Using Ctrl Shift left mouse button, I can view the Voronoi texture. I increase the scale to decrease the size of the texture. To change the color of the Voronoi texture, I add a color ramp. I change the black color stop to a bright yellow and the white color stop to a bright orange. I move the white color stop to the left to increase the number of orange spots and decrease the number of yellow spots. I add a geometry node to add some contrast between the convex parts of the pumpkin and the concave parts of the pumpkin. Using Ctrl Shift left mouse button, I can view the geometry node. I change the output to pointiness. I duplicate the color ramp and change the black color stop to a pure black. I then move the black color stop to the right, making adjustments to both color stops. Add a mix color node and mix the two textures. I change the blending mode to add and decrease the factor. I also change the roughness factor to 1. I add a bump node between the first color ramp and the principled shader, making sure to use the height input. I activate the invert option and lower the strength. I duplicate the bump node and place it between the original bump node and the principal BSDF shader. Add a noise texture and connect the first mapping node. I connect the factor into the height of the second bump node, deactivating the invert option and increasing the strength. Use Ctrl-Shift left mouse button to view the noise texture. I change the scale to 3.5 and the detail to 10. Add a gradient texture and use Ctrl-T to add a texture coordinate and mapping node. I change the input of the texture coordinate node to the object. I use Ctrl-Shift left mouse button to view the gradient texture. I rotate the y-axis on the mapping node so the gradient is dark at the bottom and light at the top. Add a color ramp and change the white color stop to the orange of the other color stops, changing the blending mode to easing. I duplicate the mix color node and change the blend node back to mix. I connect the third color ramp and the second mix color node. I select the stem and add the pumpkin material. To make sure I don't override the pumpkin material, I click on the new material icon. I now rename the new material. I change the colors of the color ramps. I also change the Voronoi texture to a noise texture and connect the factor to the color ramp. Add a new color stop on the first color ramp and change it to green, making adjustments to the color stops. And make adjustments on the other nodes as needed. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you enjoyed this video about modeling and texturing a pumpkin in Blender, you may enjoy this video. Have a good day.